Hi, welcome back to my channel and a new video. So today I'm going to be ranking the entire filmography of Ridley Scott. Of course, we've just recently had the release of Gladiator 2, which means we now have 29 films to talk about. A huge career for Ridley Scott. He's done so many movies over so many genres, and I think he's definitely one of the most interesting of our time. So I've really enjoyed going through this list of films. I'll say once we get towards the top of the ranking, we're talking about some of my favourite movies of all time. He's done some amazing stuff over the years, but there were a number on this list that did not work for me. There have been some misfires over the years, even from this great director, so it's going to be an interesting list to go through. And this is also going to be my first collaboration on the channel. I'm going to be doing this with Clayton over at Ages of Film and also Brian Lomax. We're all going to be releasing our rankings at the same time, so once all of our videos are live, I will leave links and all that stuff down in the description below, so you can go and watch those and compare our rankings and we can have some fun discussing it. So I'm not going to go into these movies in a huge amount of detail, otherwise we could be here for hours talking about this many films, but I will give you my general gist of my thoughts on each one. But please do let me know down in the comments what you think of Ridley Scott, which of his movies you love, which ones you don't like, and do leave me a ranking as well of all of the movies of his that you've seen. So anyway, let's get into this ranking, starting right down at the bottom at number 29. I decided to go with Exodus, Gods and Kings. I thought this was a terrible movie. Now, I'm not particularly into the historical epics and the biblical stories and all of this kind of stuff, which is a genre that Ridley Scott does like to tackle. And don't get me wrong, there have been some amazing films in this genre, but Exodus is definitely one of the worst of those I've seen. And there was something that just annoyed me about this film. I think the fact that it's such a big production with so much money, this incredibly talented cast. You've got Christian Bale, you've got Joel Edgerton, you know, set in these amazing locations in Egypt. Everything going for this movie, and it's just a completely hollow experience. I found it impossible to connect with anything going on here. There was nothing to sort of emotionally invest yourself in. It's all very shallow in terms of how the plot is told. And I know some people get some enjoyment when you get to all the plagues and all that sort of stuff, but even then I sort of felt a bit like I was watching something out of like a disaster movie by Roland Emmerich. You know, just not like the level of class we're used to expecting with someone like Ridley Scott. So yeah, it's a drag of a movie. It was a chore to get through at a 2.5 hour running time. I did not enjoy this one at all, so this was an easy pick for me to go at the bottom of this list. It's a film that definitely needs to be forgotten. At number 28, I'm going with Robin Hood. Like Exodus, I just thought this movie was really dull and a massive chore to get through this one. I feel like being an adaptation of a Robin Hood story, there needs to be that sort of sense of adventure and fun. And just like a level of excitement, I think, whilst you're going along with this story. And I just didn't get any of that from this. It's all set in very grey environments with bland characters and a dull storyline. And I understand it was Ridley Scott wanting to kind of take a darker, grittier version of the Robin Hood story, but there's just no fun to be had with this movie. It was really crying out for something to spice it up and get a bit of drama mixed in here because, yeah, this one was a bit rough for me to get through. And I think when I'm not connecting with a film emotionally, you start to notice a lot more of the flaws with it. Like, I thought a lot of the dialogue was really weak. I started to find Russell Crowe's accent a little bit grating, or what he was attempting to do with it here, I didn't think was very good. And, you know, whilst that final battle does have its moments, I feel like it's kind of unusual for a Ridley Scott action film to not have those sort of big, visceral, bloody battle violence that we're used to seeing. And obviously because this was made for the more PG-12A audience, you don't even really get to have that. So I assume that was for trying to make this a bigger financial success. But yeah, just nothing really in this film for me. Fair enough if you like it, if this is your kind of thing, but definitely not for me. 27, I'm going with Legend, and this was an interesting film. I'm glad that I saw it. This was back in 1985. It definitely feels like a more experimental project from Ridley Scott, and It's an interesting film because there are a lot of amazing physical effects, you know, in terms of the practical work, the devil that is played by Tim Curry. He's quite entertaining to watch, and it does give you this kind of otherworldly feel. Like a lot of the set design and stuff, it feels like you're in the middle of this fairy tale, and there is something kind of impressive about that, but I just wasn't really gelling with the story, this kind of fantasy story. It was quite messy. It all became a bit grating and loud and annoying to get through. And I have to admit, I was sort of relieved to see it was one of Ridley Scott's shorter movies in only 90 minutes. You know, coming to the end of this, it was a bit like easing off tight shoes. Kind of interesting though, it was bizarre to see Tom Cruise in a role like this. I think if this was made any year after 1985, you would never have seen Tom Cruise in a role like this. So I know there are some people that get a little bit out of this movie and do quite enjoy it, but it's just not for me. I'm glad I've seen it, but I found it a little bit difficult to watch. 26, I'm putting 1492 Conquest of Paradise. So this was the story of Christopher Columbus and his voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to discovering mainland America. Now, I'm certainly no history buff, so I don't know what the nuance is here of how this character's been portrayed, what's true and what's not. From what I do know, I do think this is probably a little bit of a romanticised version of the character, this kind of dreamer and this guy who just wanted to kind of explore and whatnot. I suspect it wasn't actually like that. But again, it's a movie like the bottom two for me, just boring, it's dull, it's difficult to get through. I do think there are some quite striking sequences from like a visual perspective, like when the ships are first approaching the land for the first time, you get the music and everything. There are some nice moments like that. But overall, I just didn't find the story particularly engaging. I did really struggle as well with the lead actor. It's Gerard Depardieu, and apparently he's a very revered French actor, but he was just not doing it for me here. I really felt like he was overacting it, overdoing it in certain scenes. Like a lot of these sequences when it's set back in Europe, I thought were quite rough. And just his very French accent trying to speak in English for this running time, I did start to find very grating towards the end. There are some good moments though. You know, you get Michael Wincott turns up in the second half, and he's always fun to watch as a villain. He's just born to play villainous roles, isn't he? So that was fun. But overall, again, not a movie I don't think I'd ever have interest in revisiting. But if you are interested in the history and you want to see a take on that story, there might be something here for you. 25, I'm going with Kingdom of Heaven. Now, I am aware that there is this very long extended director's cut of the film, which is meant to be the much sort of deeper and like richer version of the film that kind of fleshed out all of the themes and just made for a much more interesting experience. I may go back to see it one day. I saw the theatrical cut for this and it was okay. I didn't mind it. It just felt like a medieval action film to me. It was well done. The action sequences were pretty good. You know, all of the set design and stuff is quite amazing. It is quite an immersive world and story, but it does suffer from that thing that a lot of these kind of studio cut movies do, where it feels kind of choppy and edited down, but it's still overly long. So it kind of ends up being an unpleasant experience. And this is a great example of a movie where you can see how important having a good leading actor is, because Orlando Bloom is just nowhere near strong enough to lead a film like this. Like, I don't dislike him, he's a good side character, he looks good, you know, he fits these kind of roles, but as a lead, like if you compare someone, like you think of Russell Crowe in Gladiator, he's just nowhere near on that level, and I think you can feel that in this film. He hasn't got the personality, he doesn't have the presence to carry a big scale film like this, especially when he's surrounded by a cast that's much better than him. So not a bad film. I thought it was okay. If this is your thing, I get why you like it, and maybe one day I'll go back to seek out this extended director's cut. Number 24, my first controversial take I think on this list, and easily the most disappointing film for me on the list, and that is The Duelist. Now, I did enjoy some things about the movie. I loved the sword fighting. I thought the choreography of that was entertaining. It was fun to watch. I really enjoyed Harvey Keitel's performance as this madman. And there was something kind of I don't know if it was intentional or not, but there was something funny about this drama of these two characters, like the ridiculous lengths they're willing to go to protect their pride and their honour. You know, going back to duel every year just because they can't let this one thing go. It's like spans over like 15 years until they have to take each other out via a duel. So there is some fun with this movie. I just felt like it didn't really spend any time properly developing these characters, so you never really get a feel for who these people are. You can't really connect with them. You're just watching this series of events playing out. I think it also suffers from that thing that a lot of Ridley Scott movies do for me, is it's set over a long period of time and it's difficult to tell what's set where. Like one scene you're in one place following one character and then suddenly it's years later, and the transition between them just feels a little bit clunky to me. Just some bad editing as well, like the horse duel where they do that jousting battle. Some of the editing on that feels really clunky to me. Like, you can definitely tell it's a lower budget and more of a first film. Like, if you think about the quality jump from this to Alien, it's just mad. But it was okay. I just felt a bit disappointed from it. I thought it was a fun movie, but I was hoping for it to be a little bit deeper than it actually was. So I have to admit, I'm a little bit confused about this one. I will go back again to revisit it one day, but I just thought it was okay. 23, I'm going with Matchstick Men. So it was quite nice to see this as like a different change of pace for Ridley Scott. Used to doing these huge kind of epic scale, big stories, and here doing more of a black comedy. And I quite enjoyed it. You know, if you've got to be in the mood for Nick Cage, this definitely feels like a role that was designed for him. He's playing this con man who's got all these phobias and these issues and stuff, and then in the middle of all of his stressful life, his long lost daughter that he doesn't know he's had turns back up in his life, and he has to deal with all of that. So it's a role written for Nick Cage, and if you think you'd enjoy that, you'll like Matchstick Men. I thought it was a fun movie. There was definitely one detail throughout that I found quite distracting, where I was sitting there just like, why did they decide to do that? And then it ends up being explained in the final twist reveal, and I was like, oh, I kind of understand why now, but it just, something about it didn't work for me. I can't really explain it. It's an interesting twist. It's a little bit out there, I thought, but it takes away some of the sort of emotional core of the film, I think, in a way. And I think there was a few things that were a bit distracting about it. It's a fun movie, though. Don't get me wrong. I do think once it kicks into gear, you know, it does take a little bit to get going, but about halfway through, there are some really fun sequences, and the cast are good. Sam Rockwell is really good as well. So it's definitely worth a watch if you like this kind of thing, and to see Ridley Scott doing something a little bit different. 22 is Someone to Watch Over Me, a movie that probably some people won't even know this is a Ridley Scott film. It's one of his older films that's kind of been forgotten, I think. And whilst it's not really a good movie, I wouldn't say, I do just like the genre. This is an erotic thriller, and it came out in the late 80s when you had a whole load of these type of erotic thriller movies. And, you know, I just quite enjoy them. They're quite easy watching for me. They're easy for me to get invested in. I love the women cast here. You know, you've got Mimi Rogers and Lorraine Bracco. I find them both very intriguing and nice to watch. And it's just quite an interesting little drama. I think the conflict with this kind of gangster guy who's stalking Mimi Rogers' character, I think, is a little bit underwhelming where it goes in the end. But for the most part through the film, it's fairly gripping. And I could watch it. I thought it was all right. But I think when you compare it to the other erotic thrillers from that time, when you think of stuff like Fatal Attraction and like Basic Instinct a little bit better later, way better movies than this. This kind of really does pale in comparison. And I think you can tell that Ridley Scott is a little bit out of his comfort zone doing a film like this compared to what he's used to normally doing. But I did have some fun with this one. 21, I'm going with Napoleon. Now, I know a lot of people aren't big fans of this film. It wasn't that well received. And it's another one kind of like Kingdom of Heaven, where it's actually another studio cut. There's like a really long version of the film, and this does feel kind of edited down in a way that stops the film from kind of flowing naturally. But I did think there were some really good scenes in this and some good sequences. I felt like there's a version of this film that could be really good. I feel like Ridley Scott should have focused on one particular event in Napoleon's timeline and really kind of delved into that, invested us in a smaller scale story rather than, again, kind of going over years and years where it's difficult to tell how big a time jump there's been in between scenes, and it just becomes difficult and a chore to follow because it's such a long film as well. But you do have Joaquin Phoenix here. You know, he's great at playing these socially awkward, slightly unhinged characters. I thought his portrayal of this kind of mad French general Napoleon was quite intriguing. As there were things about this film that I liked. I think the first half was definitely better. There's some really good scenes, but towards the end I kind of felt myself like checking the time. Come on now, it's, you know, not a film I'm rushing to rewatch, but I do think it is quite interesting, and I just feel like it could have been something more. Number 20, I'm going with A Good Year. This one was definitely better than I thought it was going to be, given what I'd heard about it. And again, it's Ridley Scott kind of out of his comfort zone, doing a very light-hearted comedy and going for this kind of irreverent humour, which is something that I do quite enjoy. You know, it feels like it's a bit of a worse version of an Alexander Payne comedy. You know, if you like his kind of stuff, this is kind of a poor man's version of that. But I do enjoy that kind of stuff, and there were a number of moments that really did have me laughing in this film that kind of surprised me. Some good funny lines and stuff, and I didn't mind following along with the kind of romance plot. You know, Marion Cotillard, she's very charming and gorgeous and kind of intriguing. So I did like the chemistry and stuff between her and Russell Crowe. And, you know, kind of funny though at the end where he's like debating this life. Like, which one do I go for? Do I go back to the grey office blocks in London and work myself to death 7 days a week? Or do I sit out in France drinking wine with this gorgeous woman and live out my days in peace and happiness? And they kind of treat it like it's this really tough decision for him. And I was just sitting there like, man, what are you doing? Number 19, I'm going with Body of Lies. And this is a Middle Eastern crime thriller from the mid-2000s. And it's a film that I did quite enjoy going along with. I thought it was all right, if not particularly memorable. And the main issue is I feel like this is just a film that could have been so much more. You know, it's tackling a relevant kind of political issue of the time, you know, the kind of the fears in the Middle East, the threats of terrorist attacks, kind of when it was very relevant in time, kind of telling this intense spy story. I thought it was going to be just more. I just felt like it was going to be a really intense film that was going to stay with me. Leonardo DiCaprio, you know, one of the best actors of our time. And I just felt like the whole thing was a little bit underwhelming. I feel like in a year's time, like, am I actually going to remember anything that happened in Body of Lies? I'm not sure. There were some frustrating moments as well, like when you have Leo DiCaprio's character talking to his boss, who's played by Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe's kind of keeping certain information from him and kind of messing with him a bit. And it's never really clearly explained why that's happening. The kind of conflict between them when they end up meeting up. I wasn't sure if I wasn't just keeping up with the movie, but I didn't really understand what was going on with that. So there are some messy moments like that. I think all the twists at the end are a little bit convoluted, but you know, it's definitely watchable. There's some good action. There's some good scenes. The actors always keep it watchable, and there are some good moments throughout it. As I say, I just don't think it's a movie that's really going to stick with me. 18, I'm going with Alien Covenant, and it's painful for me to have this down so low because I absolutely love the alien world. And this was a really disappointing film for me when I first saw it, because as you'll see later in this list, I really love Prometheus. I'm one of the seemingly few people that loves that movie, and I liked the different direction it was going. And I was interested to see where this was going to go, and I do think there is some interesting story stuff here. I do like the first half in particular, when you get back into the character of David, this kind of creepy AI that's been living in the caves on this planet for 10 years. You see what he's been up to with these designs, what he's done to the engineers, everything like that. It's all quite unsettling and interesting, and there are some kind of philosophical angles raised, and there's some interesting discussion to have with that first half. but it gets lost with some strange and unusual moments that I think don't quite work with the film. And the second half for me just turns into just a big action film mess. Like, I'm not one to always bitch about CGI, there's definitely a place for it, but to turn this incredible alien design into this sort of computer game looking graphic and these great big over the top action sequences between the alien and these scientists, it just completely lost me. It just felt so out of place. I thought it looked ridiculous, like something out of a video game, and it really sort of kills the movie for me. So it's one with some good ideas in there. I just think the overall film, every time I get to the end of it, I think, oh, like it just doesn't click for me. And I didn't used to think it was my worst Alien film, but when I think about it now on recent rewatch, I used to really think Resurrection was my worst, and now I'm like, I can't really decide between the two of them. So definitely a disappointing sequel to Prometheus, because I did love where that story was going. Next up at 17, I'm going with Hannibal, and this of course being the sequel to Silence of the Lambs. I have watched this movie a number of times because I do love the story overall of this, going from Silence of the Lambs to this. But I could never quite articulate, I don't think, when I was younger, why I just felt like this was a huge step down from Silence of the Lambs, like many people did. And I think it just doesn't have the same scale. The characters aren't as well developed. It kind of favours going for the more sort of modern horror movie route, where it's all about the shock, it's about the nasty stuff, you know, the whole scene with Ray Liotta being fed his own brain. I felt like it was just there to have this kind of shocking, disgusting scene. You got this weird character with Mason Verger put in there, just a lot of really grim storylines that felt like a bit of a distasteful sequel to the original, because even though, of course, the original is a horror film, Silence of the Lambs is very much a horror story and a kind of crime thriller, but it just has so many interesting elements about it. It's about making you feel uncomfortable with the atmosphere and the characters, how they're developed and all of that, and I felt like so much of that was lost in Hannibal. It's still a watchable film. I still quite enjoy, you know, I like horror quite a bit, and Anthony Hopkins is still great. There are still good moments and sequences in it. I just think it's obviously, when you compare it, you can't help but compare the two, and it's clearly the inferior sequel. And I just think as well, changing the actress to, I don't know why it was changed, but they replaced Clarice's character with Julianne Moore from Jodie Foster, and they just feel too different. Like, you're meant to kind of get back into the dynamic and the connection between her and Hannibal Lecter, and because you feel like she's a different person, it feels like you're kind of starting again. It just, yeah, it didn't engage me the same way as it did in the original. So a very inferior sequel, but overall it's not a terrible film. I still have fun with it. I can watch it and I think it's okay, but yeah, it was nothing on Silence of the Lambs. At 16, I'm going with House of Gucci, another movie that I don't think was received particularly well, but I actually found this film quite interesting. Just kind of this bizarre history of Gucci and this family business that basically tore itself apart through the family members getting too greedy, trying too hard to take power and influence over the business, backstabbing each other, and the whole thing fell apart of this fashion business. Didn't know anything about this prior, and it's quite an insane story, especially when you get to the end. I was like, wow, I did not expect it to go in that direction, but I think the performances here are entertaining to watch, both for the good ones and the bad ones. Like, you've got Lady Gaga, who's really amazing, really committed and invested in the role. She's great to watch, but some of the other performances are quite over the top and ridiculous, especially when you're adding in all these dodgy Italian accents as well, when you've got Jared Leto under all this makeup, and Al Pacino. Yeah, it's all a bit much at times. Actually, bad accents, that's something that really affects a lot of Ridley Scott movies. Just some kind of bizarre choices in there, and this was one of them. So it's a mixed bag, but it's still an interesting film, even though I don't think it entirely works. It's definitely a bit too long and a bit meandering at times, but I was fairly intrigued with this one. I thought it had some good sequences, and I was interested for most of the running time. Definitely quite a cold, emotionless ending though, and whilst obviously it's based on true events, that's what happened, I still felt it could have been done in a way that was less jarring. Like, what Lady Gaga's character, what she does at the end, doesn't feel consistent with the way she's played the character through the rest of the movie, so that kind of felt a bit awkward and a bit unnatural to me. So I don't know if it was just the portrayal or the way they wrote the story or what, but yeah, there's some good things about this one, but it's not a perfect Ridley Scott movie. There are issues with it, but I do still think it's worth a watch. Number 15 is Black Rain. So this is a detective police thriller from the 1980s. Pretty much what you'd expect from one of these kind of movies. But I definitely have fun with this one. It's a good action film. You've got Michael Douglas in the lead, who is one of my favourite actors from that time. Just so watchable, always very engaging. You've got this amazing location in Japan. It's just kind of amazing to look at. I love kind of following these characters there and stuff. And the movie moves along nicely. I get why a lot of people do really enjoy this one. It's good fun. It's definitely good fun. I think the only issue I had with it is that it did feel quite predictable. It felt like there was a bit of a checkbox list of the detective who's secretly got a good heart, but he kind of does a lot of dodgy stuff. He cuts corners. He's kind of a little bit corrupt, but there's a good man in there somewhere. He meets the opposite detective who doesn't like him at first, but comes round to him. It's like, it does feel like it really is going through every sort of generic plot point you'd expect in one of these kind of movies. It doesn't really do anything to sort of subvert expectations, I don't think, at any point. So whilst it is a kind of a generic film of this time, it's definitely enjoyable, and I'd be happy to go over and watch this one again. 14, I'm going with G.I. Jane. This movie I actually think is a bit underrated. I enjoyed this more than I thought I was going to. I'd heard some bad things about the film. Obviously, Demi Moore was criticised for her performance, but I think she's really likeable here. I think she's a good presence. She's obviously very enthusiastic about the role, and there are moments where it does feel a bit over the top, but I don't know why, I just kind of really enjoyed this film. It's one of those stories, obviously, where she's training to be in the Navy SEALs, and it's this whole kind of political thing about the first woman as like the kind of beta testing for it. Will it actually work? Will women go into the military? There's some little bits of interesting stuff done there. But for the most part, the interesting and fun stuff comes in all these training sequences. If you think of stuff like Full Metal Jacket, I just find there's something satisfying about watching, people go through the sort of army military training. And this is one of those films. I think it's pretty great. You've got to appreciate the shape she got into for this film as well. She looks amazing, and you kind of believe that she's keeping up with these big guys here doing all these insane training regime. It's good fun to watch. I love the conflict between her and Viggo Mortensen's really harsh general character. There's some really good scenes between them. I think it is let down at the end by that action sequence, which is rubbish, and I have no idea why. It's like Ridley Scott, he's obviously really good at directing action, but there's just one scene towards the end where they're actually under real stakes in that under that mission. It was just like, what is this? It kind of let down a bit at the end, but overall I actually really quite enjoyed G.I. Jane. Number 13, I'm going with All the Money in the World, and this was a film I'd never seen before. This was one of the first time watches. The only thing I remember about this film was the fact that Kevin Spacey had been recast. It's quite interesting that Ridley Scott, rather than try and cover it up in the trailers or get around the marketing of it, he was just like, nah, let's just get another actor in who's good, get out there, shoot the scenes quickly, and we'll make this work. And he did a damn good job of it, because Christopher Plummer, who replaced Kevin Spacey, he's really great in the role, and you could never notice that this thing had any kind of production issues. It's nicely done. But this one's another one that's based on a true story about this young lad who had been kidnapped on a trip in Europe, and this gang they were holding him for ransom from his granddad, who was like this multi-billionaire big oil investor, and he was like the tightest guy alive. He tried to negotiate and haggle these people down and tried to find any way to get around the tax on it rather than just pay the money, as this poor young lad was just slowly carved up and had body parts mailed back to the family. And it's one of those films where it's really about seeing how the disgusting nature of greed, and like how you actually feel at some points that he is actually worse than the gang that have kidnapped this guy. But it's definitely an interesting film. It's pretty amazing. This actually based on true events, a wild story. It's got some very powerful moments as well, some good drama here. I liked the performances a lot as well, and just some really interesting and some nice moments throughout this. Definitely quite a bleak film, not one you'd sort of rewatch that often, but really glad I saw this one because I did did think it was a very interesting story. 12, I'm going with White Squall, and this was a really good movie actually. I'd never seen this before either, and whilst I did really enjoy it, I think the one thing that put me off it was the fact that this year I saw for the first time Dead Poets Society. And if you've seen the both of these, you will know that they are unbelievably similar. Like, okay, White Squall was also this one based on a true story about these boys out on this sailing ship that, you know, got stuck in this storm. It all went wrong. But the style of how the movie is made with the certain plot points, the characters, the development of that, it's literally just the same movie as Dead Poets Society. Even down to that final scene, I was like, wow, they really are sort of ripping off the ending to that film. But undeniably, there's some powerful moments in the film still. You know, you've got Jeff Bridges in the lead. He's fantastic. You get really into his character. You know, he's this guy that's like quite harsh on these young guys discovering themselves, going out sailing, but he knows how to connect with them. He knows how to get them to kind of overcome their weaknesses and kind of find themselves and stuff. So there are a lot of heartwarming moments. I liked the drama of it. Some nice performances from the young cast as well. You got young Ryan Philippe, which was cool to see here, playing quite a different character to what you're used to seeing him play back in the late 90s. It's a nice film. I enjoyed going along with it. I just felt like I'd seen the same film not that many months prior to this, but definitely a good movie and one that's kind of, I guess, more forgotten these days, but certainly worth checking out. Number 11, I'm going with The Counselor. Now, this is another controversial one on the list. I'm sure some of you might be looking at this list with raised eyebrows now, thinking, what the hell is The Counselor doing so high up this ranking? It's a rubbish film. And I wouldn't really know how to argue you on that, because you know, this movie has been critically panned. A lot of people are like, what the hell is this? And there definitely is something not right about it. I just found the whole thing very intriguing and interesting. And even though it's not a very cohesive film, I think a lot of the scenes don't really make sense with each other. You know, it's this crime thriller story about these intertwining stories where shit goes really wrong for these main characters. And you're just kind of watching everything go downhill for them. And it's just an interesting movie. Like, each scene in itself individually, you can't really take your eyes off the screen. All the bizarre dialogue and the way they discuss things, it's got kind of a slightly unsettling feel about it all. Like, you get this one scene with Javier Bardem where he's explaining about the mechanical device that like decapitates you, and you're kind of left wondering through the whole film, like, are we going to get to see this thing? There's just lots of strange moments throughout this film, but I was pretty gripped by it. It's quite an interesting film. It's, you know, it's got a great cast. It's got a really overly sexual vibe about it, which just kind of puts something interesting into the mix as well. And I think it could have built to something better towards the end. It felt like it was going to really kick off, and then at some point the movie just suddenly stops and you're like, oh, okay, well that was that then. So yeah, it's a movie that doesn't really work, and I didn't really fully understand the plot, but for some reason, I just really enjoy watching this film. Like, on this list so far, out of all the movies I've talked about, this is the movie where I'd be most interested to watch again. Just because there is something about it that I do like, but there's definitely could have been a better version of this. But I totally get why so many people think it's crap. Okay, so we're going into the top 10 now, and these are all movies that I do genuinely really like. All of these I've rated a 4 out of 5 or higher on my letterbox. These are movies that I genuinely would highly recommend, I really love. So starting number 10, I'm going with The Last Duel. One of the movies, again, that I saw for the first time this year. Kind of missed this one when it came out. Feel bad now contributing to the very low box office that this movie just kind of failed commercially, which is a shame. But it's actually a really good film. I kind of like the style of these stories where it's, you know, a story told from 3 different perspectives. You kind of go through each of the stories one by one and see the different perspectives. And there's something about that that just really engages me. I loved going along with this. It did take a little bit to get going. I thought the first 20 minutes, I was like, all right, where's this going? But I feel like after a certain point, it really gripped me, and then I was in. And I really enjoyed the rest of the film. I think the performances are good. You've got Adam Driver, Jodie Comer, Matt Damon. It's just a really interesting movie. And this is one of the ones of Ridley Scott. I don't know if I've mentioned this so far, but Ridley Scott, I feel like, often doesn't do that satisfying endings. I feel like endings are where he slips up the most. He needs better endings. And this one has a really good one, like that final duel, the joust match on the horses between the two guys at the end of this whole court situation it's led up to. Absolutely fantastic. It looks amazing. It's so brutal and it's just a nail-biting scene. And I came away from it like, damn, that's actually a really cracking movie. So yeah, I was really impressed by this one. So if you, like me, missed this back when it came out of the cinema, I'll definitely give this one a go. It's really good. Number 9, I'm going with Gladiator 2. Look, I've done a review for this movie and talked about it. I don't understand why it's getting so much hate. I feel like people are making a hobby out of hating movies now. And yeah, it's a really fun movie. I don't understand it. You know, it's not as good as the original. As you can see, it's way lower down the list for me than the original. It's not as good. You know, the first is a classic. It's a movie that people love to death. People loved the performance from Russell Crowe, as do I. So people probably just don't want to see a sequel to that, which I kind of do get. But I think if you judge it as a film in its own right, it's definitely worth seeing. You know, I liked all of the drama in Rome at the Colosseum once it gets going. Once you get through the initial plot elements, it's setting up very similarly to the original. I think I got really invested in the film. I liked Paul Mescal in the lead as well. I thought he was great. The action, whilst it is all, yeah, it's very over the top. It's not that grounded. It is all a bit crazy, but I don't know, if you're just looking for a good time with these movies like I am, I don't think there's anything wrong with Gladiator 2. You know, it's not a perfect film. There's definitely some ridiculous moments and a few issues with it here and there, but can't say I understand the hate with this one, to be honest. I seem to be on a different page to other people, but see my review if you want my further thoughts on the film, but personally I liked it. Number 8, Black Hawk Down. Now this was also a first time watch for me, this movie, and I thought this was really fantastic. It's a very, very dark, brutal war film from just over 20 years ago now. And it's, yeah, talking about the conflict in Africa, and it kind of raises some interesting questions about, you know, things that are still relevant now, like should Western forces still go in and try to enforce peace in places that, you know, seemingly don't want to have peace. You know, you have ideological wars and you have militia groups that kind of raise and dominate over people. And it's like, do we leave that side of the world to their own device and get on with our lives? Or do we have sort of like a humanitarian duty to help these people? And those movie kind of dives into a few of those questions. And I wish it had gone a bit deeper with that as well. But because obviously the most of this, once it's set up, it really is just an immersive war film. But I still loved it for that experience as well. And it's, yeah, it's bleak and it's grim, and it's about showing you like a few days in the life of this military operation gone wrong, and just absolute chaos, watching this group of guys trying to get out of this situation alive. And yeah, just very immersive action. You feel like you're there with them. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. And yeah, it's quite a movie. Not one I want to watch too often because it is really harsh. It's very brutal. I did feel myself going slightly white watching that scene where they're trying to physically clamp that guy's artery in his leg as he's bleeding out after being shot. Just so gruesome. And yeah, not the easiest movie to watch, but quite an amazing war film, and definitely one that's worth seeing at least a one time. Number 7, I'm going with Thelma and Louise, and I really enjoyed this movie, and this was the first big movie Ridley Scott did again after Blade Runner. Really came back with a bang with this film, and I think it's just interesting to watch now because you look back in sort of the 80s and the early 90s, you didn't have loads of films with kind of interesting and complex female leads. You know, you did have a few films that people always talk about, your Alien, Terminator and whatnot, but this was kind of a different kind of story, having these kind of just very intriguing women leading this film. And it's a good story as well. It's a road trip movie. And yeah, I really got into this film. I have a good time with it. It's a great mix of being light-hearted and fun, whilst also being quite a tragic movie, quite a dark movie, and definitely does get you thinking a little bit as well. Something about the tone of it and the way it balances the two, I think really works. Gina Davis, the two women are both great, but I think Gina Davis in particular, something about her, I really love her. She's just, plays this great role here. I saw her recently in The Fly as well. I just think she was fantastic. It's a great role for her. And just when everything starts to get really crazy towards the end, you feel for these two kind of going on this journey before that insane ending, which I had never seen before. I didn't actually have this spoiled for me. When I first saw this, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe they just ended the film like that. And the more I've thought about this since I've watched it, the more I like it. So yeah, really, really good film. It's definitely a must-watch for fans of Ridley Scott. At number 6, I'm going with Gladiator. And I know this is quite low probably for some people. A lot of people really, really love Gladiator. It's one of their favourite films. And I definitely get it. It is an amazing film of its time as well, telling this kind of historical epic of the times in Rome with the gladiator battles. It's quite an incredible story. And, Russell Crowe just at the absolute peak of his career as Maximus here. He's got the personality, the gravitas for it. And he really is what makes the movie, I think. Great villain as well with Commodus, played by Joaquin Phoenix. I love the conflict between the two of them and how it builds to that final confrontation, which is great. And definitely a film that warrants rewatches as well. Lots of interesting details throughout the story that makes it like quite a rich experience of a film. It's really quite good. It's just not high for me because it's not typically my kind of film, I guess. I still think it's great. I don't quite see it as the perfect film that some people do. It's not so untouchable that we couldn't be allowed a sequel to it. That's why it's a little bit lower than probably for other people. They might see this as quite low, but definitely a great film. I have seen it a number of times throughout my life and I will continue to watch it. I do think it is great, but just not one of my all-time favourites. Into the top 5 now, I'm going with American Gangster. I'm so glad I rewatched this for this list. I hadn't seen this movie in the longest time, maybe 15 years now, and I didn't really remember all that much about it, to be honest, but I'm so glad I rewatched it because this is a damn good gangster movie. And I think the thing is, I feel like it often gets a little bit forgotten because when you think of the amazing gangster films, like especially the Scorsese stuff with Casino, Goodfellas, they had scenes and sequences where it's like they just stay with you forever, just unforgettable moments in those films that really stay with you. And I don't think this movie quite has that. But for people that are fans of these type of gangster movies, this is a really fantastic story. It's based on a true story as well of this crime boss, kind of how he was moving heroin in and around the United States during the time of the Vietnam War. And it's just a really great story, kind of this cat and mouse game where you've got the detective trying to run him down, a bit like the story of Heat, really, told here again by two great actors, Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. It's just really a brilliant film. I say if you haven't seen this in a long while, definitely go back and give this one a fresh viewing because definitely one of the top gangster movies. I couldn't believe how much better this one was than I remembered. It's because it's not quite on that level of some of the all-time great gangster films. I think this one gets pushed to the side, but it's absolutely fantastic. Number 4. Now, a lot of people are going to say this movie should definitely not be this high, but it's Prometheus. I just absolutely love this film. I love sci-fi stories. As you can see, all the top 4 movies for me are all Ridley Scott sci-fi epic movies, and it's just more in my wheelhouse, I guess. It's more of the kind of stuff that I find interesting in movies, immersing myself in a sci-fi world, talking about technology and alien, all this kind of stuff for me just really gets me. And whilst Prometheus is far from a perfect movie, there is a lot of things wrong with it, I think. Stupid character decisions, some weird moments of storytelling that don't entirely make sense. I get it, I'm with you. I guess some of those things just don't really bother me in the same way as other people, like characters in life and death situations making dumb decisions in movie. It just doesn't quite doesn't bother me maybe in the same way as other people. Like some people just can't get over that and it derails the whole film for them, and I just don't feel that way. I don't necessarily think that Alien needed a prequel. It's kind of nice to have the story as a mystery, but if you are going to tell a story that delves into those themes that were set up in that original with AI and the company and all of this kind of stuff, I think it's an interesting movie to tell. It expands the lore in a very unique way, and I love going along the story with this, and just some absolutely amazing sequences of horror as well, like the whole scene with Noomi Rapace as she has to go into that medical bay that that basically has to try and pull this alien out of her and stitch her back up while she's stuck in that bay. Just absolutely an incredible, gnarly sequence that gets imprinted in your brain forever. So I really like Prometheus. I watched it again recently leading up to my Alien ranking, and I just was like, I don't get why people don't like this film. I think it's fantastic. So I guess I'm on an island with this one, but what can I say? I love it. Number 3, I'm going with The Martian. So just like what I said with my number 4 choice, I absolutely love Ridley Scott's sci-fi movies. And I think The Martian is just absolutely fantastic. And what I like about this movie is it's kind of a little bit less dark for Ridley Scott. It's more of a feel-good, almost a more family-friendly movie. But that doesn't stop it from being also just a really interesting story with stakes that's done in a very intelligent way. Just like the whole mix of how he did this here really works for me. Like, it's got a load of heartwarming moments. It's quite fun and light-hearted at times. But there's also quite a serious story going on here as well, with some really interesting things going on. There's some really devastating moments as well. You know, kind of learning about the story of this botanist stuck on Mars, and he's trying to kind of rebuild for himself whilst he waits for the rescue to come, and all the kind of drama he goes through whilst he's there. I'm just absolutely gripped by this movie, and because there is that sort of fun, light-hearted tone to it as well, it's one that I can always go back and re-watch. And something about the whole movie just really works for me. You know, the music throughout as well. And even though that ending is maybe a little bit on the cheesy side, you kind of know where it's going. I can't deny, I find it moving. I really get into it. And yeah, I think this is just a brilliant movie. And not to say that people don't like this. I wouldn't say it's necessarily underrated. But I don't know if it's often talked about as one of Ridley Scott's best. But I watching this again recently, I was like, this is absolutely fantastic. And I just kept moving it up my ranking when I was looking at this list, because it's such a great movie. And also my girlfriend has paid me off to put it this high, because it's basically her favourite film. Number 2 is Blade Runner. So this was Ridley Scott's 3rd movie back in 1982. And I've only seen this movie, I think, twice in my life. And it's one of those movies you have to really set aside the time to be in the mood for it and fully immerse yourself in the story. But when you do, this movie is just a hell of an experience. Just this world he created here in the story of Blade Runner, just absolutely mesmerising, and it's an incredible world. I love him going back to tackle all of those themes that he's really interested in, with the artificial intelligence, things just as relevant today as they were back when he was making this in the 1980s. Just a very interesting story between the replicants and the Blade Runners that are trying to catch them. And I think what's interesting is this idea about, you know, these replicants that still have all these dreams and memories like that of people. It's kind of this idea of like, if a machine, you know, if the simulation of this machine is built and made exactly like a human, if it's simulating that of a human, what really is the difference? And I kind of like all those interesting discussions that come out of a movie like Blade Runner. You know, it's too slow for some people. Some people find it too boring and difficult to get into, which I can kind of understand in a way. But for me, it just, what can I say? It just works for me. It's very like dreamlike. I feel, and when I watch this movie when I'm in the right mood, I just get sucked into this world, and it leaves me thinking about it. It's a movie that really has made a mark with me, and I'm really interested to see it again. It's great as well because it's Harrison Ford here, and I'm not the biggest fan of Harrison Ford. You know, when he's kind of doing his smarmy one-liner type roles, I've become tired of them over the years. But here he's a lot more subtle, playing a much quieter character, and I think he's fantastic. And of course, obviously the standout being Rutger Hauer as the lead replicant. And just absolutely amazing. When I first saw this, I'd never heard of Rutger Hauer, and just wow, what an absolutely beautiful performance. Like those final scenes with him, just amazing. Just the final act of this film is just it's just absolute perfection in my opinion. So yeah, I really love Blade Runner. I'm always interested to read stuff about the film. I think the movie's actually had like 7 or 8 different cuts as well. So yeah, it's got quite an interesting history, this film, but yeah, seeing this one in the right mood, the right frame of mind, there isn't many experiences like it in film, I don't think. I think it really is, for me, one of the all-time greats. And number 1, of course, is Alien. I have talked about Alien a number of times on the channel, so I won't go too far into it again. I seem to always be talking about the Alien films because I really do love them. And it's unbelievable that this was Ridley Scott's second film. I mean, why is it so good? I don't understand. Why is it better than any movie he ever made again after that? I can't understand. Something about this whole film just came together incredibly well. You know, Dan O'Bannon's script and story mixed with Ridley Scott's direction early on in his career. This incredible cast of very, you know, kind of creating this very natural dynamic and very immersive film where it feels like you're following characters in a real situation up in space, dealing with this unknown life form. And just the thought of seeing this movie back in the cinema in the day when you didn't know what was coming, it must have been absolutely amazing. So yeah, it's one of the all-time best sci-fi horror movies. It's right up there. It's one of my favourite movies of all time. The alien design, just absolute perfection. We've never had anything like it again. It's the stuff of nightmares, just unbelievably good. And yeah, this film is just the way it's edited, the atmosphere. Every single scene has something interesting in it to take from it. It's rewatchable. It set up one of the best leading women ever in film with the character of Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver. It's just an absolutely stunning movie and a masterpiece. One of my most logged films ever. I love it to death. So easily for me, my number 1 film. So that is my ranking for all 29 of Ridley Scott's movies. I know that's a lot of films to get through, so please do leave me your ranking down below of the movies that you have seen, and let me know what you think of my choices as well. Obviously this is just my opinion and my subjective list, so feel free to have some fun down in the comments disagreeing with me, and we'll have some fun discussion. As I said at the start as well, I'm not doing this video on my own. I'm doing it with Clayton at Ages of Film and Brian Lomax, so once their videos are live too, I will be leaving all their links down below in the description box, so you can go over to their channel and check their videos out. So thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and do please consider as well subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and you are enjoying my content. But do take care, and I'll see you next time.